Hello, this is an AQA A-Level Sociology video on the crime topic. I have a feeling this video might be quite long, but it's got everything you need in it. First, we're looking at crime mechanisms of control. Crime consists of activities that break the law and are potentially subject to official punishment. However, not all criminals are caught, and not all laws are strictly enforced. There is often room for interpretation about whether a law has been broken or not. Deviance is a behaviour that doesn't follow the norms and expectations of a particular social group. Deviance can sometimes be seen in a positive light, but in practice most deviance is seen negatively. The sociology of deviance concentrates on the negative aspect. All societies attempt to prevent and reduce criminal and undesirable deviant behaviour. The ways in which this is done is through mechanisms of social control. Mechanisms can be formal or informal. Formal mechanisms include the criminal justice system, involving the police, courts, and prisons. Informal mechanisms consist of mechanisms which aren't based upon formal rules but are carried out by members of society in everyday life, like stigma. The use of positive and negative sanctions are crucial in maintaining social control. Deviance is often negatively sanctioned. Their behaviour generally results in widespread disapproval and punishment through formal mechanisms if they are caught. More minor acts of deviance may be subject to informal negative sanctions such as criticism or exclusion from social group. Positive sanctions are used to encourage behaviour which is deemed desirable. Social control is also achieved through the socialisation process, whereby members of society learn that behaviour that is deemed desirable in their culture. Delinquency consists of antisocial criminal acts committed by young people. A functionalist analysis of deviance looks for the source of deviance in the nature of society rather than in the biological or physiological nature of the individual. Although functionalists agree that social control mechanisms such as the police and the courts are necessary to keep deviance in check, many argue that a certain amount of deviance can contribute to the well-being of society. Durkheim believed that crime is an integral part of healthy societies. This is because individuals are exposed to different influences and won't be committed to the shared values and beliefs of societies. Even in a society of saints where everybody tries to obey norms, complete conformity will be impossible. Even the most minor, perhaps unintentional act of rudeness will be seen as a serious deviance. Crime can be also functional. All societies need to progress, and all social change begins with some form of deviance. In order for change to occur, yesterday's deviance must become tomorrow's normality. Durkheim believed, however, that very high rates of crime or deviance indicated that something had gone wrong with society. Durkheim believes that societies need both crime and punishment. These help to highlight society's norms and define moral boundaries. Without punishment, the crime rate would reach a point where it became dysfunctional. Merton explains how deviance can result from the culture and structure of society. He begins from the functionalist value consensus that all members of society share the same values. The legitimate means of achieving a goal is through talent, ambition, and effort. Great emphasis is put upon achieving success goals, but less on using legitimate means to achieve success. The idea of the American dream is widely accepted in the USA. However, in reality, the path to the top is often blocked for those from poorer backgrounds. There's inequality of opportunity. The result is an imbalanced society where winning is all and the rules aren't very important. The situation where there is too much emphasis on the cultural goals and not enough on institutional means is known as anomie. Individuals may respond to this in different ways. Conformity. The most response where conformists strive for success through the accepted channels. Innovation, where people from the lower classes may have few qualifications and turn to crime to achieve material success. Anomie can also affect a smaller number of people from the middle class because there's no limit on success. Ritualism is where people, particularly the working class, may abandon the ultimate goal of wealth but continue to conform to the standards of the middle class respectability. Retreatism is where dropouts who have rejected both the shared value of success and the means provided to achieve it. Rebellion is those who reject both goals and means but replace them with different ones. They wish to create an entirely new kind of society. The solution to these problems is to place more emphasis on institutional means and to produce equality of opportunity. Marxist Taylor criticises Merton for failing to consider wider power relations in society, that is, who actually makes the laws and who benefits from them. Merton also assumes that there's a value consensus in American society. and that people only deviate because of structural strain in society. In reality, groups have different values. His theory exaggerates the working class and underestimates white-collar crime. Taylor also argues that the theory can't account for politically motivated crime, where people break the law because of a commitment to a cause. Merton has been defended by Rayner, who believes that Merton's theory can be adapted to take most of the criticisms into account. Structural theories of deviance explain the origins of deviance in terms of the position of the individual in society. Subcultural theories of deviance explain it in terms of the subculture of a particular social group. Certain groups develop norms and values which are different from those held by other members of society. Cohen modified functionalist Merton's positions and combined both structural and subcultural theories of deviance. Cohen criticizes two aspects of Merton's working class deviance. According to Cohen, deviance is a collective rather than an individual response, and Merton ignores non-utilitarian crimes. These are crimes that have no financial reward, such as vandalism and joyriding. Lower working class boys want success but can't achieve their goals because cultural deprivation leads to educational failure and dead-end jobs. They suffer from status frustration and turn to delinquency to gain status within a peer group. An alternative set of norms and values is adopted, a delinquent subculture, which reverses mainstream culture by valuing activities such as stealing, vandalism, and truancy. This solves the problem of status frustration, as they gain high status from other members of the subculture for their delinquent behaviour. Fox argues that Cohen's theory only applies to a minority of delinquents. Most delinquents never accepted mainstream success goals in the first place. Martzer conducted research which suggested that most delinquents aren't committed to delinquent subculture, nor are they totally opposed to society's values. Rather, they drift in and out of delinquency, so the idea of highly integrated and distinctive subcultures is a myth. Cloward and Olin accept Merton's explanation of deviance in terms of the legitimate opportunity structure, but they argue he failed to consider the illegitimate opportunity structure. Just as the opportunity to succeed by legitimate means varies, so does the opportunity to succeed by legitimate means. They also believe that there's a greater pressure on the working class to deviate because they have less opportunity to succeed by legitimate means. They identified three possible responses to this situation. Criminal subcultures emerge in areas of established organised crime, where young people are exposed to deviant values and role models. In this situation, young people have the opportunity to rise within the established criminal hierarchy. Conflict subcultures develop in areas where there's little access to either legitimate or illegitimate opportunity structures. The response to this situation is often gang violence, which serves as a release from anger and frustration as a means of achieving prestige in terms of values of the subculture. Litigious subcultures are organised mainly around illegal drug use and occur because members are double failures who have failed to succeed in both legitimate and illegitimate opportunity structures. Neo-Marxist Taylor criticised Merton, Cohen, and Cloward and Olin for assuming everybody is committed to the success goal of achieving wealth. They point out that there are other possible goals and that other groups like hippies make a conscious choice to reject conventional goals. The marketisation of capitalist societies has made these theories increasingly relevant. South believes that British drug trade is largely based around disorganised crime, which can be compared to Cloward and Olin's conflict subcultures, although some of it's based around professional criminal organisations and more closely resembles a criminal subculture. Many of the drug users themselves are part of a retreatist subculture. The next slide is about the underclass and crime. New right sociologist Murray has suggested that an underclass now exists that doesn't share the same values as other members of society. The underclass is responsible for a large proportion of crime, and he blames welfare benefits which have made it possible for young women to become single parents, and for young men to reject the idea that it's important to hold down a job. Neo-Marxist Taylor rejects the new right views, but still believes that the underclass exists. Left realist Young explains that unskilled working-class males have been affected by increasing inequality and declining job prospects. Underclass criminal activity is a result of material deprivation rather than an unacceptable culture. However, many sociologists have questioned the idea that there's a distinctive underclass culture. Most criticisms refer to the views of Murray. Tam compared the welfare policies and crime rates in Britain and Sweden. During the 1980s and 1990s, he found that crime increased more rapidly in Britain than Sweden, which had a more generous welfare state. He claims that crime rates are closely linked to the levels of inequality. Mooney argues that there is no link between single parenthood and criminality. However, research indicates that single parents are more likely to become the victims of crime than to become criminals themselves. This section is about official crime statistics. Many theories of crime are based on the official statistics provided by government organisations, such as the police and the courts. This information is often taken as an accurate measure of the total amount of crime. The crime data allows comparisons to be made between crimes and with previous years. These statistics tend to show two main trends: that some social groups appear to be more involved in crime than others, and crime rates in Britain increased from the 1950s to the 1990s. Social groups are more involved in crime are working class, the young, males, some ethnic minorities for some crimes. These groups appear to be more likely to commit crimes than comparable groups, like the middle class, elderly, females, and white people for some crimes. Sociologists such as Merton and Murray have taken these statistics at face value and gone on to explain why these groups appear to commit a disproportionate amount of crime. Crime rates in Britain remained low until the 1950s, but then increased rapidly until the mid-1990s. There was then a period when crime rate fell, although with the start of recession in 2008, there was some evidence of rates starting to rise again. In recent years, the vast majority of offences have been property offences. Often the release of crime figures receives widespread publicity and leads to a concern that the country is experiencing a crime wave. Maguire points out that official crime figures don't include all crimes. Many crimes dealt with by other agencies such as the British Transport Police, tax evasion and benefit fraud, for example, aren't included in the official crime statistics. Statistics are also impacted by changes in recording policies. For example, after 1997, offences of criminal damage involving property worth less than £320 were included for the first time. In 1997 and 2002, changes in recording practices led to an increase in crimes recorded by the police. Not all crime that takes place are recorded by the police. For a crime to be recorded, at least three things must happen. Somebody must be aware that a crime has taken place, the crime must be reported, and the police or other agency must accept that a law has been broken and decided to record. Some crimes, such as tax evasion, don't have an obvious victim, and it's these that are least likely to be reported. However, attempts that have been made to estimate the amount of crime which victims are aware of, but which is not reported to the police, is not recorded as a crime. Instead of relying on police records, it uses victimization studies. These involve asking individuals if they've been the victim of a crime in the previous year, whether they have reported the crimes or the police recorded them. These surveys reveal that the police crime statistics are highly unreliable. In 2006 and 7, less than half of all crimes were reported to the police. Reporting varied enormously according to the crime. 93% of vehicle thefts were reported, 26% of assaults without injury, and 32% of vandalism was reported. Most crimes aren't reported because they're thought to be too trivial, or it's felt that the police can't do anything about them. For many violent offences, people felt that the offence was a private matter or said that they would deal with it themselves. Up to 40% of all incidents reported to the police weren't recorded as crimes. This was because the police judged the incident as too trivial, didn't believe that it had taken place, felt that there was insufficient evidence to proceed, or the victim didn't want to pursue the matter. In terms of trends in overall crime rates, figures from the British crime surveys are broadly in line with the official police statistics, with the overall crime rate beginning to fall in the mid-1900s. Crime survey and police statistics are now published together by the government and are used together to give an overall picture of crime trends. Data from British crime surveys are still not entirely reliable. Kroll identifies four main problems. Crimes can only be reported if victims are aware of them. The results are limited by respondents' memory and their definition. The survey is restricted to households, so doesn't cover crimes committed against businesses or organisations. The sample doesn't include people under 16. So the findings of the British crime survey should be treated with caution. However, they're probably more reliable than the official statistics because they include so many crimes that aren't reported. Only a small proportion of offenders are convicted of crimes. In 2006 and 7, only 26% of crimes known to the police were cleared up. Self-report studies attempt to discover the characteristics of criminals. They use questionnaires or interviews and ask individuals to admit the number and types of crimes they have committed. Their data can then be compared with official conviction rates to discover which types of offenders are most likely to be convicted. Using data from 40 self-report studies from different countries, Box rejected the impression created by official statistics that working class youths are more likely to engage in delinquency than middle class youths. A more recent study by Graham and Bowling found that social class has no influence on whether young British males and females would admit to having committed offences, although lower social classes were more likely to admit the more serious offences. However, individuals may wish to conceal their criminal acts. However, it's estimated that around 80% of those who reply do tell the truth. It's likely that self-report studies identify more offenders than the official statistics. Statistics on crime from the police and victim studies indicate that the chances of being a victim aren't equally distributed. The most likely victims of violent crime are young males who live in poorer areas and go out 3 or more times a week drinking. Victims of violence are most likely to be attacked by somebody they know, and in the case of women, especially partners or ex-partners. 79% of rapes are committed by men known to the female victims, and over half of rapes are repeat rapes to the same offenders. People from ethnic minority and ethnic groups are at most risk for personal crimes, such as street robbery, partly because they're more likely to live in inner city areas, be poor, and have single parents. The British Crime Survey of 2006 and 7 found that 32% of victims of vandalism were victims more than once, as were 28% of victims of violence. Some people are particularly prone to the multiple victimization. Many criminologists suspect that the middle-class offenders are less likely than working-class offenders to be convicted of offences they commit, but due to the lack of self-report studies with adults, it's not possible to compare the results with official statistics. However, there is evidence that offences committed by individuals of high social status don't often appear in the official statistics. Sutherland was the first sociologist to study white-collar crime. He defines it as crimes committed by people of high social status and respectability in the course of their occupations. Nelson questions Sutherland's definition. White-collar crimes may be committed outside the course of occupations, and some crime may be responsibility of organisations and corporations rather than the individuals. There are various types of white-collar crime. Commercial corruption and fraud. One type of fraud is insider dealing, in which shares in a company are bought by individuals that know that the company is about to be the subject of a massive takeover bid. Crime causes personal harm. According to Streeter in the late 1990s, the effects of asbestos were killing 3,500 people per year. Political and organisational corruption. The MP Jonathan Atkin, a member of the last Conservative government, was found to have accepted hospitality at the Paris Ritz from Mohammed Al-Fayed in return for asking questions in Parliament. He was later imprisoned for trying to cover this up. Corporate crimes are committed by businesses or corporations, usually to increase the profits of the corporation rather than the benefit of the individuals. Such offences could result in massive losses of money. Corporate negligence can lead to massive physical harm. Inadequate safety at a factory in Bhopal, India in 1984 led to an escape of poisonous gas, which left more than 3,000 people dead and more than 20,000 people permanently injured. A number of factors combined to reduce the apparent extent and seriousness of white-collar and corporate crime. White-collar crimes are difficult to detect as they don't have many obvious victims. In cases of bribery and corruption, all those involved can sometimes benefit, so nobody is likely to report the offence. In cases where the victim is the public, large individual members of the public have no knowledge of the offence or the expertise to realise that they're being misled. Government agencies lack the resources to follow up more than a few cases. Even if they are detected, a few white-collar crimes lead to prosecutions. The power and influence of many of those involved mean a blind eye is often turned or only an official warning is given. Cases of professional misconduct are usually dealt with by the relevant professional association, which may simply hand out a reprimand. Official statistics probably significantly underestimate the extent of white-collar and corporate crime. As a result, crime is viewed as predominantly working-class behaviour. In the case of corporate crime, it can be difficult to attribute blame to particular individuals, so many cases prosecutions never take place. Functionalist Cohen argues that the scope of criminology should be expanded to include crimes committed by the state and human rights abuses. States and their agents may commit crimes and illegal human rights abuses which contravene the laws of their own countries or binding international agreements. The war on terror has highlighted crimes committed by terrorists, who are sometimes state-sponsored, but also by national governments themselves. The USA has been accused of human rights abuses, including torture, and other abuses have been recently reported in many countries, including China, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say that one, Iran, Syria, and Burma. State crimes are often covered up and rarely result in prosecutions because the state has the power to decide what offences are prosecuted. One shocking example of a state crime, which did come to light, was carried out by the French government when its secret service blew up a Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, in 1985, murdering one of the crew. Some criminologists go further and have introduced the idea of transgressive criminology, which believes that criminologists should study actions which do harm to others, whether or not they're conventionally regarded as crime. Marxist Chambers studied the crimes of the state from a Marxist perspective and found the US state was involved in money laundering, arms smuggling, and state-sponsored assassinations. Phenomenologist McLaughlin studied the state, arguing that because the state claims a monopoly of the legitimate use of force, it can claim the right to force whenever it's seen as in the public interest. However, there's often no agreement about what constitutes the public interest. Green criminology follows studies of state crime in extending the definition of what is seen as criminal beyond conventional law-breaking. It sees actions which harm animal and plant species and the environment as a form of criminal activity, whether or not they're illegal. Lynch and Strachey believe green criminology should study the individuals or entities who kill, injure, and assault other life forms by poisoning the earth. There are three approaches to green criminology. Situ and Emmons study offences which damage the environment and break national or international laws. Brathwaite and Dreyhus extend green criminology to include legal actions which damage the environment. Late modernist Beck puts green criminology in the context of major changes in society. He argues that we've entered a risk society. Technology developments have reduced the scarcity of goods, leading to a decline in class conflict. But this has resulted in massive damage to the environment, increasing the risk of man-made disasters. Marxist South gives examples of what he calls primary crimes, crimes which directly harm the environment even though they're currently legal. These include air pollution caused by governments, deforestation, species extinction, and water pollution. South also gives examples of secondary crimes which result from the flouting of environmental laws. A problem with wider definitions of green crime is that there may be no agreement on what consumes harm to the environment. These are the perspectives on crime. Interactionists examine how and why particular individuals and groups are defined as deviant, and the effects of such a definition on their future actions. Becker suggests that there's really no such thing as an inherently deviant act. An act only becomes deviant when others perceive it as such. He writes social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviance and by applying those rules to particular people. He gives the example of a brawl involving young people. In the working class, this may be defined by the police as delinquency. In the middle class, it may be defined as youthful high spirits. The acts are the same, but the meaning given to them is different. If youngsters are defined as delinquent and convicted, then they may become deviant. In other words, they've been labelled as deviants. Once an individual or group has been labelled as criminal, mentally ill, or homosexual, others see them only in terms of that label. It becomes what Becker calls a master status. Labelling also causes the label group or individual to see themselves in terms of the label. This may produce a self-fulfilling prophecy in which the label actually makes itself come true. There are 4 stages in this process. The individual is labelled as deviant and may be rejected from social groups. This may further encourage deviance. The deviant career is completed when individuals join an organised deviant group, thus confirming and accepting their deviant identity. Now a deviant subculture may develop which includes norms and values which support their deviant behaviour. Becker's approach is used by left realist Young in his study of hippie marijuana users in Notting Hill, London. The police officers see hippies as dirty, lazy drug addicts. Police action against marijuana users unites them and makes them feel different. As a result, they retreat into small subcultures. Deviant norms and values develop in these closed groups. Hair is grown longer, clothes become more unconventional, and drug use becomes a central activity. Thus, a self-fulfilling prophecy is created. Nemeth distinguishes between primary and secondary acts of deviance. Primary deviance consists of deviant acts before they're publicly labelled. Trying to find the causes of primary deviance is not very helpful because samples of deviance are inevitably based in those who have been labelled, and they're therefore unrepresentative. Also, most deviant acts are so common that in statistical terms they're normal. Primary deviance has therefore little effect on the person's self-concept and behaviour. The important factor in creating deviance is the reaction of society, the public identification of the deviant. Secondary deviance is the response of the individual to the societal reaction. Neo-Marxist Taylor argues that labelling theory is wrong in suggesting that deviance is created by the social groups who define social acts as deviant. Some acts will always be regarded as deviant in society. It's claimed that labelling theory is too deterministic. It assumes that once a person has been labelled, their deviance will automatically increase. I can suggest that all individuals might simply choose to be deviant, regardless of whether they've been labelled. Many sociologists claim that the interactionist approach fails to explain why individuals commit deviant acts in the first place. Phenomenology focuses on the way in which some individuals and groups come to be labelled as deviant. Cicero applies a phenomenological approach to understanding the treatment of delinquency in two Californian cities. He observed how the police used stereotypes of the typical delinquent when selecting who to stop and question. They were more likely to stop juveniles in bad low-income areas of town and high crime rates. Once arrested, the juvenile was more likely to be charged if they fitted the picture of the typical delinquent. This includes a broken home, a bad attitude to authority, a low-income background, and more. Middle-class juveniles were less likely to be charged with an offence. They were seen as ill or temporarily straying from the correct path with a real chance of reform. Their parents were better able to present them as respectable and reasonable and negotiate justice on their behalf. Delinquents are produced by the agencies of social control. Cicero has been criticised by neo-Marxist Taylor for failing to explain where stereotypes of the typical criminal come from in the first place. He has no theory of power. Marxist Snyder notes that the capitalist state is often reluctant to pass laws that threaten the profitability of large businesses. Often the state has worked hard to attract large corporations and doesn't want to risk alienating them. Snyder argues that many of the most serious deviant acts in modern societies are corporate crimes. She claims that corporate crimes cost more in terms of loss of money and lives than crimes such as burglary and robbery. She estimates that street crimes cost $4 billion per year, but in the USA, the losses from corporate crime are more than 20 times greater. Chandler suggests that much of what takes place in the creation of rules is non-decision making. Many issues, such as the way health is distributed, never reach a point of a decision. Chambliss argues that the greed, self-interest, and hostility generated by capitalist society motivates crimes at all levels within society. Members of all classes use whatever opportunities they have to commit crime. Given the nature of capitalist societies, crime is rational. Marxists argue that crime is widespread in all parts of society. There are many examples of illegal behaviour by white-collar criminals and corporations. Left realists believe that Marxists put too much emphasis on corporate crime. Street crime such as burglary causes greater harm than Marxists imply. Their victims are usually working class and the consequences can be devastating for them. Postmodern criminology rejects Marxist criminology as being neither believable or defensible. Crime hasn't been eradicated in communist societies based on Marxist principles. Neo-Marxists Taylor, Walton and Young outline what they call a fully social theory of deviance. They believe that some criminals act like Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, and believe that some offences should be decriminalised. Others are political crimes where a person chooses to support a just cause. The criminologist must consider the following aspects of deviance: the way in which wealth and power are distributed, the circumstances surrounding the decision of an individual to commit an act of deviance, the meaning of the deviant act for the person involved, the ways in which other members of society respond to the deviant act, the meaning of this response in terms of the way in which society is organised, and the impact of the deviant label. Criminologists need to look at the relationship between all these different aspects so that they can be fused into one complete theory of deviance. Feminists have criticised its concentration on male crimes. Some new left realist criminologists have accused it of neglecting the impact of crime on victims and romanticising working class criminals. Left realists Walton and Young re-evaluated their earlier work. They accept that some of the criticisms, but argue that recent approaches such as realist, feminist, and postmodern criminology are all committed to creating a more equitable and fair society. In this respect, they are each continuing in the tradition of the new criminology. Postmodernists reject the traditional approaches to crime. They don't believe that crime can be linked together, and that common factors which can cause them can be identified. They regard each criminal act as unique. They don't believe it's possible to engineer reforms to improve society. Effective ways of dealing with crime must be local and individual. Collier believes that there are stereotypes of masculine behaviour which affect people's understanding of masculinity, but that these are misleading. In the postmodern era, masculinity is multifaceted, and the individual's identity is also multifaceted. There is an increasing uncertainty about what it means to be a man. Therefore, you can't generalize about how masculinity relates to a crime, but need to examine individual cases. Collier can be criticized for sometimes making generalizations about masculinity, despite arguing that such generalizations shouldn't be made. Left realist Leah believes that postmodernism has made a useful contribution to the study of the control of crime. In the postmodern world, informal control mechanisms can come to dominate at the expense of the state. Private security firms watch over shopping malls, and CCTV follow our movements around town and city centres. Security firms present undesirables from entering some estates. People are treated differently in different areas and are seen increasingly as customers and consumers. However, left realist Leah also believes that postmodernism is regressive, since it denies the possibility of being able to do anything to change unequal and unjust societies. This section is about left realists on crime. Left realists see their position as close to the British Labour Party. Most left realists describe themselves as socialists and argue for the reform of society rather than revolution. Left realists take the view that crime is a real problem which must be taken seriously, and they present a number of criticisms for previous criminology. Some sociologists have tried to explain the huge rise in street crime since World War II by pointing out to the unreliable nature of criminal statistics. Young argues that the rises have been so great that they can't simply be explained by changes in reporting and recording. Some sociologists have advanced the view that chances of being a victim of street crime are minimal. However, Leah and Young point out that while this is true, particular groups face high risks. These groups are the poor and deprived, ethnic minorities, and inner city residents. Those with low income also suffer more if they are robbed or burgled. Left realists have carried out a number of victimization studies and found a widespread fear of crime. Many people, particularly women, alter their behavior to avoid becoming victims of crime. Leah and Young attack the idea that offenders can sometimes be seen as promoting justice. They attack the image of criminal presented in the parts of the new criminology as a type of modern-day Robin Hood. While accepting that white-collar and corporate crime are commonplace and serious, left realists argue that recent criminology has concentrated too much on such crimes. Left realists have acknowledged the importance of underreported and under-recorded crimes such as sexual assault, harassment, racially motivated attacks, and domestic violence. They claim to take all crimes equally seriously. Leah and Young base their attempt to explain crime around three concepts: relative deprivation, subculture, and marginalisation. Relative deprivation explains that deprivation will only lead to crime where it's experienced as relative deprivation, when it feels deprived relative to similar groups or when its expectations aren't met. In modern societies, advisors stress the importance of economic success and promote middle-class lifestyles and patterns of consumption. Rather like Merton, Leah and Young argue that rising crime is partly the result of rising expectations of high standards of living, combined with restricted opportunities to achieve this. Subculture explains that groups develop lifestyles to cope with the problem of relative deprivation, and subcultures can form as a result. However, these can vary. Marginal groups are those that lack organisations to represent their interests in political life. These groups tend to use violence and rioting as forms of political action. The key to avoiding marginality is employment, as workers have clearly defined objectives such as higher wages. Kinsey et al. Argue that there are a number of flaws in policing. The clear-up rate is very low, so the police are unable to deter criminals. The police spend little time actually investigating crime, and the police rely on a flow of information from the public, but public confidence in the police is declining, particularly in inner city areas and among members of ethnic minorities. Without the support of the public, the police have to resort to what the authors call military policing, stopping and searching large numbers of people using surveillance technology. As a result, those who are directly involved with the police come to see them as an alien force intent on criminalising local residents, a process known as the mobilisation of bystanders. Kinsey et al. Argue that the key to the police success lies in improving relationships within the community. To achieve this, they recommend that the public should have more say in shaping police policy, and the police should spend as much time as possible actually investigating crime. Young believes that certain crime are over-policed and others are under-policed. In the former category are minor drug offences and underage drinking. In the latter are racially motivated attacks, corporate crime, pollution, and domestic abuse. Young doesn't believe that crime can be dealt with simply by improving the efficiency of the police. Left realists see the problem of crime as rooted in social inequalities. Young suggests that policies should aim to improve leisure facilities for the young, reduce income inequalities, raise the living standards of poorer families, reduce unemployment and create jobs with prospects, and provide community facilities which enhance a sense of belonging. Left realists believe that crime can only be understood in terms of the relationship between four elements in the square of crime. It's important to understand why people offend, what makes a victim vulnerable, and whether they choose to define incidents as criminal and report them, the factors that affect public attitudes and responses to crime, and the social forces that influence the police and the rest of the criminal justice system. Recently, Young has argued that we're entering a period of late modernity which is making the problem of crime worse in a number of ways. Late modernity is characterised by great uncertainty and instability in areas such as family life and work, which makes people feel less secure and stable. There's less consensus about moral values. Instead, an increasing variety of subcultures claim that their values are legitimate. In the work of leisure, there's an emphasis on immediacy and personal pleasure. People expect to be able to, but the consumer goods of their choice and to have lots of fun. At the same time, there are fewer secure jobs and there's rising inequality. In these circumstances, increasing numbers of people are likely to experience marginalisation and relative deprivation. Informal social controls are becoming less effective as families and communities disintegrate. A major reason for rising crime rates is the problem of relative deprivation. There are a number of reasons why this is significant. Inequality has increased in recent years. Marketisation places great emphasis on individual material success. High levels of cultural inclusion are combined with social and economic exclusion. Many people feel that they're not properly rewarded for their efforts at work. The middle class feel disconnected because of their long working hours, and they sense that other groups are not becoming part of the mainstream without necessarily making the sacrifices they have. Everybody's feelings about relative deprivation are made worse because of the proximity of different social groups. Crime becomes more widespread. It's no longer confined to a deviant minority. Crime becomes nastier. There's an increase in hate crimes such as racially motivated attacks. The consensus of what constitutes crime breaks down. For example, the boundaries of acceptable violence are disputed. Left realism has had more influence on crime social policies than other theories. The police in Britain now employ civilians to do routine tasks, thus freeing police officers to investigate crime. The police are also beginning to take crimes such as domestic violence more seriously. Labour's slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, echoes the idea of left realists. However, the reduction of inequality, a key factor underlying crime rates for left realists, hasn't been addressed as much as they would have liked. Hughes argues that it fails to explain the causes of street crime. Left realists have not gathered empirical data about offenders' motives. Hughes also attacks left realism for its reliance on subcultural theory, which has also been heavily criticised. Jones argues that left realism fails to explain why some people who experience relative deprivation turn to crime whilst others don't. Jones also identifies flaws in the emphasis on victims. Left realists take victims' account of fear of crime at face value and never ask victims for their views about the causes of crime. They only take into account the views of victims in urban areas where crime rates are high, thus giving a misleading impression of how harmful crime is. Ruggiero argues that left realists have neglected corporate and organised crime, and that this type of crime can't be understood within the framework of their theory. Young believes that Labour government attempts to reduce crime by forcing truants to go to school and unemployed youth to go to work. And clamping down on antisocial behaviour won't be a success because these policies are trying to recreate a golden age of community that doesn't exist anymore. Young believes that a sense of relative deprivation will only be reduced if rewards in society are seen to be distributed more fairly. This would mean dealing with inherited wealth, discrimination on the grounds of race, sex, and other things. This section is going to be about right realists on crime. Wilson denies that trying to get rid of poverty will lead to reductions in crime. This policy failed in the USA in the 1960s, and many poor people don't commit crimes. Wilson concentrates on street crime, which he believes the general public are the most concerned about. He sees crime as a result of rational calculation. People will commit crime if the likely benefits exceed the likely costs. In reality, the chances of getting caught for a particular crime are quite small. If offenders don't believe they're going to get caught, or if punishments take place long after offences, then even more severe punishments won't deter people. Strong communities are an effective way of dealing with crime. People who are disgraced by their involvement in crime will lose their standing in community. The problem is that the crime itself undermines communities. Wilson and Kelling believe that it's crucial to try to maintain the character of neighbourhoods and prevent them from deteriorating. The role of police is to clamp down on the first signs of undesirable behaviour. They should try to keep drunks, prostitutes, drug addicts, and vandals off the street, and law-abiding citizens feel safe. If a single broken window is left unrepaired, the area will start to deteriorate. Law-abiding citizens will feel safe on the streets, and informal social control will break down. The answer is to concentrate on areas that are starting to deteriorate before they worsen. Some areas are too far gone to save. Wilson and Hairston argue that some people are born with a predisposition to crime. Their potential for crime is likely to be realized when they're not properly socialized. Where close-knit nuclear families are absent, effective socialization is unlikely. This links to new right sociologist Murray's views of the underclass and single parents. Wilson and Hairston believe that people have free will. Ultimately, they choose whether to commit crime by weighing up the costs and benefits. They argue that it's too easy to live off welfare benefits, and the potential gains from crime are increasing as society becomes more affluent. For many people, the benefits of crime come to outweigh the costs, and the crime rate increases. Some aspects of right realist thinking has been influential. Zero tolerance policy is based on the idea that it's effective to clamp down at the first sign that an area is deteriorating, as is the use of ASBOs. Generally, both Labour and Conservative governments in Britain have been keen to increase the number of police, have stricter sentences, and build more prisons in order to catch and punish severely criminals. Matthews finds little evidence that tolerating broken windows and minor incidents lead to an increase in crime. Left realist Jones argues that factors such as lack of investment are far more important in determining whether a neighbourhood declines. Concentrating attention on minor offences means that more serious offenders are more likely to get away with their crimes. If neighbourhoods are made up more orderly, then disorderly criminals will simply move their activities. The biological approach ignores the role of inequality and unemployment causing crime and neglects white-collar and corporate crimes. Despite the influence of right realist policies, the crime rates in the USA continue to rise. This section is about market forces and crime. Some sociologists are particularly critical of the increasing importance of market forces in Western capitalist societies and have analysed the impact this has had on crime. Taylor is interested in how changes in the global economy and the ways in which some politicians have responded to these changes have affected crime. He argues that the deregulation of financial markets has provided increased opportunities for crime such as insider trading, where financiers use privileged knowledge to make illegal profits. Marketisation has increased opportunities for crimes such as insurance fraud and false claims for subsidies from the European Commission. Unemployment has become a more or less permanent feature of some areas. Lack of opportunity and hope leads some turn to crime. Changing patterns of work have created more opportunities and incentives for criminal activity. Ruggiero et al. Believe that subcontracting encourages the employment of people who are working illegally or in conditions and wage levels that fail to conform to national laws. Success is increasingly associated with expensive consumer goods. At the same time, inequalities have increased rapidly. Taylor sees crime such as car theft as related to these changes. There are few opportunities for young working class men in cities which are suffering from deindustrialization. At the same time, the culture of entrepreneurship encourages many young black people who confront the additional problem of racism to pursue illegitimate opportunities in the drug businesses. For less successful third world countries, producing the crops from which drugs are derived requires little technology or investment and offers high profits. This section is on cultural criminology. Most theories of crime and deviance imply that crime is committed for material gain or because people rationally calculate that they'll gain from the crime in some way. White realism particularly emphasizes rationality, as does administrative criminology. However, some criminologists argue that most theories of crime neglect the importance of emotional and irrational aspects of crime and the importance of self-image for explaining crime. Farrell argues that these alternative approaches are called cultural criminology. Cultural criminology generally rejects positive research methods, arguing that an understanding of offenders' emotional states is crucial to understanding crime. Functionalist Marxer is opposed to deterministic theories, which suggest that some delinquents are trapped by circumstances into offending. His research uses unstructured interviews with young males. He argues that there's always a choice to offend. He doesn't believe that delinquents are committed to the values of a delinquent subculture. Instead, he argues that they use techniques of neutralization to temporarily suspend their belief in mainstream values and make it possible for them to offend. Nor are delinquent subcultures well structured and integrated. Instead, people drift in and out of delinquency. The final decision to commit crimes only happens when delinquents feel pushed around and unable to shape their lives, the mood of fatalism, and decide to take action to restore the mood of humanism, a sense that they can shape their lives and the events around them. In Seductions of Crime, Katz argues that emotions of humiliation and rage play an important part in causing crime. Crime is used to resolve an intolerable situation. For example, many murderers kill their victims because they've humiliated them, and killing them is the only way to overcome shame. Minor crimes such as shoplifting are often carried out for sneaky thrills rather than material gain. Ling argues that offenders in general, and young males in particular, put themselves in risky circumstances because they enjoy being on the edge of danger and using their skills to avoid coming to harm. Ling argues the term edgework to describe this and uses the theory to explain offences such as joyriding. Cultural criminology tends to not be based upon systematic evidence, and it tends to explore marginal issues. However, it does show that emotional aspects of crime are ignored by other approaches. This section is on race, ethnicity, and crime. Kroll argues that the association of criminality with different racial groups date back to the 19th century, when the Irish were portrayed as part of the dangerous classes. Phillips and Bowling argue that in the more recent years, the issue returned to public attention because of the question of whether the overrepresentation of African Caribbean people in prison was a result of their being more criminal than other groups, or because of discriminatory treatment by the criminal justice system. Phillips and Bowling point out that British Asians were usually seen as well regulated because of close-knit communities and families, but by the 1990s they too were beginning to be seen as a problem. In 2001, riots involving Asians in Oldham, Burnley and Bradford led to parts of the media to develop an image of the Asian gang. Gilroy argued that the black criminality was a myth. British Asians and African Caribbeans originate from former colonies of Britain. Their struggle against British imperialism allowed these groups to learn how to resist exploitation. Demonstrations and riots represented resistance to a society that treated them unjustly. Gilroy claims that a myth of black criminality has been created as a result of the police negative stereotypes. High levels of crime among ethnic minority groups are the results of police prejudice. Leah and Young attack Gilroy for suggesting that the disproportionate number of black males convicted of crimes is a result of police racism. They argue that most crimes are reported by the public, not uncovered by the police. The crime rates for white people are slightly lower than that for Asian people. If Gilroy is right, then the police can only be prejudiced against African Caribbeans. Statistics suggest that first-generation immigrants were highly law-abiding. It's hard to see how they could have passed down the tradition of anti-colonial struggle to their children. Many of the victims of the crimes committed by African Caribbeans are from the same ethnic group. Leah and Young accept that police racism may exaggerate the ethnic minority crime rate, but believe that there's been a real increase in the number of crimes committed by ethnic minorities. They believe that this is largely the result of relative deprivation, marginalisation, and the formulation of subcultures. The debate about the real incidence of crime among ethnic minority groups was based on limited evidence. In the response to the Macpherson inquiry in 2000, the government first started publishing detailed statistics on ethnicity and crime. Hall et al. Argue that there was a moral panic about crime, and about mugging in particular, a crime associated with black youth. Hall et al. Found no evidence to indicate that crime of mugging was new or increasing. The moral panic over mugging could only be explained in the context of problems facing capitalism at the start of the 1970s. Economic problems and industrial social unrest meant the hegemony of the ruling class was under threat, and it had to turn to force control the crisis. Mugging was presented as a key element in the breakdown of law and order. The moral panic over mugging helped capitalism in two ways. The public was persuaded that society's problems were caused by immigrants rather than the faults of their capitalist system, and the government was able to justify the use of force to suppress the groups that were challenging them. The societal reaction to the threat of violence led to the labelling of large numbers of young black people as deviants. Labelling helped to produce the figures that appeared to show rising levels of black crime, which in turn justified stronger police measures. And this is the idea Hall created the term myth of the black mugger. Downs and Rock identified two weaknesses. The study was contradictory, claiming that black street crime wasn't rising, while at the same time arguing that it was bound to rise as a result of unemployment. The study fails to show how moral panic over mugging was caused by a crisis of British capitalism. Lefredis Young argues that the study provides no evidence that the public was panicking about mugging black people. However, he adds that the public identified the crime quite rational if the public had been concerned about street crime. Bowling and Phillips review a number of ethnographic studies of crime among British Asians. Early studies linked a low crime rate among Asians with strong families and communities. Alexander argues that the media image of growing problem of Asian gangs is something of a myth, although there was some violence in the area of South London covered by her study. It was greatly exaggerated by the media. Black ethnic groups are overrepresented in criminal statistics. For example, in 2004 and 5, they made up only 2.8% of the population, but somehow 13.5% of the prison population. Over the same period, Asian ethnic groups were slightly overrepresented in terms of the prison population. White ethnic groups were underrepresented in terms of the population amongst those who were cautioned, arrested, and imprisoned. In 2004 and 5, official figures show that black ethnic groups were 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched than the average population as a whole. Asian ethnic groups also had an above-average chance of being stopped and searched. However, this may be partly because there are simply more members of ethnic minority groups in urban areas where most stops and searches are most likely to take place. The Macpherson inquiry into the Stephen Lawrence case examined a range of evidence and concluded that there was institutional racism in the police, which reflected in statistics such as those on stop and search. Bowling and Phillips notes that in 1999 and 2000, about 4 times as many African Caribbean people were arrested and would be expected in terms of their proportion in the general population. The difference was even greater in terms of imprisonment, with African Caribbeans having an imprisonment rate that's much higher than that of white people. Hood found that when other factors were taken into account, black men were 5 times more likely than white men to be given a custodial sentence. They were also given sentences which were on average 3 months longer than those of white people who had committed equivalent offences. The discrepancy was even greater among Asian men. Self-report studies have been used to try and discover whether the rate of offending among ethnic minority groups is really higher than white people. Despite the methodological problems associated with this approach, according to Bowling and Phillips, the surveys have produced similar results, that official crime statistics exaggerate the extent of offending among ethnic minority communities. There is clear evidence that most ethnic minorities are more likely to be victims of most crimes than white people are. Data from the British Crime Survey indicates that there is an increased fear of crime among ethnic minorities. This is compounded by their lack of faith in the ability of the criminal justice system to deal with racially motivated crimes. Bowling and Phillips argue that black people are more likely to be criminalised. This in turn leads to a greater social exclusion and therefore to a greater chance of criminalisation, causing a vicious cycle. This section is on gender and crime. Feminist Smart put forward the following reasons to explain the neglect of women in criminology. Women tend to commit fewer crimes than men. Most crimes committed by women tend to be of a comparatively trivial nature. Sociology and criminology tend to be dominated by men, and traditional criminology is motivated by a desire to control problem behaviour. As women's behaviour is less of a problem than men's, it's received less attention. Official statistics indicate that women in all age groups appear to commit far less crime than men. This pattern has raised 3 questions. Do women really commit fewer crimes than men, or are the figures misleading? Is the proportion of crimes that are committed by women increasing, and is this linked to women's liberation? And why do women break the law? According to official statistics in 2005, 79% of known offenders were male and 21% were female. Just over half of offences committed by women were thefts, but thefts accounted for only a third of men's offences. Statistics from other countries and from Britain in the past show that women are generally convicted of far fewer crimes than men. Pollack argued that official statistics on gender and crime seriously underestimated female criminality. He argues that many crimes predominantly committed by females went unreported and unrecorded. Examples included shoplifting and prostitution. He also gives reasons why there would be an underrecording of female crime. The criminal justice system tends to be made up of men. Brought up to be chivalrous, they're usually lenient with female offenders. More importantly, women are good at hiding their crimes because they're used to deceiving men in matters such as revealing pain and faking orgasm. Very outdated. Hydenson regards Pollack's work as based in an inaccurate stereotypical image of women. His work has little credibility today. Graham and Molan conducted a self-report study of 14 25-year-olds and found that 55% of males but 35% of females admitted an offence in the last 12 months. This suggests that males do commit more offences than men, but the difference is not as great as that in official statistics. Buckle and Farrington found that men were twice as likely as women to shoplift, even though official figures suggest almost as many women as men are shoplifters. Hydenson argues that the justice system is influenced by attitudes to gender in society as a whole. Women are treated more harshly when they deviate from the norms of female sexuality. Sexually promiscuous girls are more likely to be taken into care than similar boys. On the other hand, courts may be reluctant to imprison mothers with young children. Carlin found in a study of Scottish courts that women are more likely to be sentenced according to the court's assessment of them as wives, mothers, and daughters rather than the seriousness of their crimes. Carlin conducted unstructured interviews with 39 female convicted offenders. She argues that working-class females have been controlled through the promise of rewards stemming from the workplace and family. When these rewards aren't seen as worth the sacrifice, then criminality becomes a possibility. Hydenson and Carlin therefore believe that the criminal justice system is gendered. It treats men and women differently. Some of the earliest attempts to explain female criminality were based on the biological theories. Lombroso compared the anatomical features of female criminals and non-criminals. He believed that male criminals could be identified by physical abnormalities, such as having an extra nipple or toe. Few women have these features, and therefore they weren't born criminals. Lombroso's work has been long discredited. Adler claimed that women's liberation has led to a new type of female criminal and an increase in women's contribution to crime. Women were taking on male social roles in both legitimate and illegitimate areas of activity. Instead of confining themselves to feminine crimes such as shoplifting, women were getting involved in robbing banks, mugging, and even murder. Hydenson attempts to explain why women commit fewer crimes than men. She argues that patriarchal societies control women more effectively than men, making it difficult for them to break the law. Control is exerted at home, in public, and at work. The time that women spend in housework and in caring for children means that they have little time for crime. Daughters are given less freedom than sons, as they can come and go as they please. Women often choose to not go out in public places because fear of becoming a victim of crime or harassment. They also limit their behaviour in public for fear of being labelled a slut or a bitch. Women are usually controlled by male superiors at home and may be intimidated by various forms of harassment. Messerschmitt analyses why different groups of males turn to different types of crime in their attempts to be masculine. In order to achieve success, white middle-class boys have to be subservient to school teachers. Outside the school, they try to demonstrate some of the characteristics they repress within school. This may include pranks, vandalism, minor thefts, and excessive drinking. Such men adopt an accommodating masculinity. White working-class boys have less of a chance of academic success and tend to construct masculinity around the importance of physical aggression. They try to be tough and oppose the authority of teachers. Theirs is an oppositional masculinity. Lower-class ethnic minority boys don't expect to be able to hold down a steady job and support a family. They may use violence to express their masculinity, or they may become involved in more serious property crime than white working-class youths. This offers some prospect of material success. Box reviewed the data from self-report studies in Britain and the USA and concluded that the official statistics on gender and crime are fairly accurate. Jefferson acknowledges the importance of Messerschmitt's work, but points out that he fails to explain why particular individuals commit crimes when others don't. He tends to assume that all men are in the same circumstances and will be socialized to express their masculinity in the same ways. Messerschmitt has also been accused of putting forward views that are rather stereotypical and negative towards men. This section is on crime and social class. The work of Merton and subcultural theories are largely based upon the idea that crime is predominantly working class activity. However, Merton doesn't recognise that there's some middle class crime, as there's no upper class limit on success. Murray believes that crime is particularly common in an underclass made up of benefit claimants and the children of unmarried mothers. Official statistics generally support the view that crime is concentrated in the working class. However, many sociologists believe that criminal statistics are a social construction and don't give a reliable and valid picture. Convicted criminals may be unrepresentative of all criminals. Studies of white-collar crime, corporate crime, state crime, and environmental crime suggest that crime is common in all social strata. Although labelling theory doesn't address class issues directly, Becker does suggest that those from lower income backgrounds may be more likely to be labelled than those from higher income backgrounds. This is supported by the study of treatment of juvenile offending by Cicero. Marxists emphasise the importance of crimes committed by the ruling class and argue that there's a class bias in the law and in the administration of justice. They acknowledge that crime is present in all classes because of effects of capitalism, which encourages greed through the crimes of the higher classes do the most harm. Left realists accept all classes commit crime but emphasise that street crime shouldn't be ignored. They argue that relative deprivation, marginalisation and subcultures might cause high levels of street crime in lower social classes. They also emphasise that the working class are more likely to be the victims of crime. This section is on crime and age. According to Newburn, more than 20% of offenders cautioned or convicted offenders in England and Wales are ages 10 to 17, and 1/3 of people are aged under 21. Amongst middle-aged and older people, offending rates decline. Research by Graham and Boulding for the Home Office found the highest offending rates for property crime for males 14 years old. For violent crime it was 16 and for serious offences it was 17. However, once fraud and forgery were included at the peak offending rate for property crime was 22 to 25. Amongst females the peak offending ages were lower, at 15 for serious property offences and 16 for violent offences. Subculturalist Cohen sees youth crime as a result of the formation of subcultures reflecting status frustration amongst working class boys who do poorly at school. Martza denies that there are cohesive subcultures, arguing that young people drift in and out of crime but may get involved to restore the mood of humanism. Ling believes youth offending is the result of testing boundaries or edgework, and Jefferson believes Teddy boys were part of the white working class attempt to recreate class loyalty where they felt it was threatened by ethnic minorities, urban development, and growing affluence. Self-report studies may not be valid, and in any case, most of the offending that young people admit to is relatively trivial. Both police studies and self-report studies fail to reveal the extent or importance of white-collar, corporate, environmental, and state crimes, which are almost entirely committed by adults. Pearson believes that there have always been moral panics about certain types of crime, and youth crime in particular, which exaggerates the fears. Cohen showed how an exaggerated moral panic about violence between the mods and rockers in the 1960s amplified what deviance there was amongst these youth groups. This suggested that youth deviance could be media creation. Control theory or social bond theory offers arguably the best explanation for the apparent decline in offending as people age. Here she argues that all individuals are likely to commit criminal acts unless they have a reason not to. What prevents some people from becoming criminals or deviants is the existence of social bonds. When bonds in society are weak or broken down, then crime takes place. In some ways, this is similar to Durkheim's idea that egoism or anomie was responsible for crime. Here she identified 4 aspects of social bonds: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. Generally, these types of bonds develop as we get older. This means as we age, we're less likely to be criminal or deviant. It can also lead to a change in our beliefs, which also increases the likelihood of conforming. This theory explains both high and low offending rates among older people and higher rates of crime and deviance amongst the young. Control theory can't explain why people engage in particular types of deviant behaviour. Writers such as Marx explain that delinquents have weak bonds to society. It can't explain white-collar crime and corporate crime, which are committed by people who, by Hirsch's criteria, have strong social bonds, and it may go some way in explaining why in nearly all societies that crime rates are highest in younger age groups. This is crime and locality. Sociospatial criminology examines where offenders live and where crimes are committed and sees neighbourhood as a factor in crime rates. Functionalist Shaw and McKay's study of Chicago School is used as a system devised by Burgess in which the city was seen as divided into 5 concentric circles radiating from the centre. The central business district was found in the centre of cities, with the next circle consisting of the zone of transition, which has the highest offending rate. They explained that this offending as a result of a high population turnover, poverty and poor housing, which combined to create social disorganisation, a situation where there was no strongly established community and therefore no shared values which could prevent offending. Shaw and McKay later amended the meaning of social disorganisation to mean a distinct set, if non-conformist values, which encouraged offending. These were passed on from generation through socialisation or cultural transmission. Felsen argues that crime rates are related to opportunity, depending upon target attractiveness and accessibility. Felsen also develops routine activity theory, which argues that more crime takes place where suitable targets and likely offenders are close in proximity. Offenders are most likely to commit offences in areas in which they spend time in or are close to where they live. Cohen and Felsen argue that burglaries tend to take place where there is no capable guardian to see and report an offence. They also argue that the time of day could be important. Together, these factors influence where and when offenders take place. People's routine activities also influence the risk of being victims. Bottoms argues that Shaw and McKay confuse where people live with where they committed offences. People from outside the zone of transition could have committed the offences there. Bottoms also points out that the concentric circles model doesn't fit the town planning and social housing model of most European cities. Later studies have looked at where offences take place and where offenders live. Wilkstrom found the highest offending rates near the centre of Stockholm and in areas where rich housing was adjacent to poor housing. Opportunity theory, routine activity theory, and cognitive map theory are together known as administrative criminology. These approaches have been used to try to reduce burglary through measures such as better lighting, blocking access to the backs of houses, marking objects with indelible ink, and more. Administrative criminology also encouraged flexible licensing laws to reduce violence when pubs or clubs close at the same time. These approaches don't explain why people commit crime, merely the circumstances in which they commit them. Furthermore, they assume that all offenders are rational, a view challenged by cultural criminology. This is the last section on the sociology of suicide, and a trigger warning if you're sensitive to this topic. Suicide is no longer a criminal act in Britain, but it's still widely regarded as deviant as it contravenes norms relating to the sanctity of human life. Durkheim tried to show that suicide wasn't just a product of individual psychology, and that positive methods could be used to study and explain acts of suicide and suicide rates. He showed that suicide rates varied fairly consistently. High suicide rates were correlated with Protestants rather than Catholics or Jews, married people rather than single people, parents rather than the childless, political stability and peace rather than political upheaval and war, and economic booms and slumps. From the statistical patterns, Durkheim claimed to have identified 4 types of suicide. Egoistic suicide was caused by insufficient integration into social groups. Enemy suicide resulted from too little regulation in industrial societies at a time when rapid social change disrupted traditional norms. Altruistic suicide resulted from too much integration in non-industrial societies, and fatalistic suicide resulted from too much regulation in non-industrial societies. Despite his association with positivism, Durkheim used elements of a realist approach in looking for unobservable structures underlying suicide rates. Positivists have generally supported the principles on which Durkheim's work was based, but have modified details. Hallworks argued that Durkheim overestimated the importance of religion. He found that living in urban areas was a more important factor correlated with high suicide rates. Gibbs and Martin tried to define integration in a more precise way than Durkheim by using the concept of status integration. Douglas points out that suicide statistics are based on the coroner's interpretations and negotiations between parties involved. The relative and friends of an individual might persuade the coroner to not record a death as a suicide. Douglas believed that there are different types of suicide based on social meanings. There are different meanings in societies. Batchelor develops Douglas's approach, defining suicide in terms of solution they offer to different types of situation. Escapist suicides involve fleeing from an intolerable situation. Aggressive suicides are used to harm others. Oblative suicides are used to obtain something that's desired. And ludic suicides involve taking risks for excitement or as an ordeal. Derace has used an interpretive approach to understanding high rates of suicide amongst young men. He conducted in-depth interviews with 32 Canadian men who'd attempted suicide. He found that many men had attempted suicide because they were perceived or actually were homosexual in a society that was still homophobic. As a result, many of the men felt isolated from social groups. Gay men who didn't consider suicide tended to be better integrated into social groups. Derace concluded that although interpretive methods are needed to understand suicide, his research still finds evidence to support aspects of Durkheim's theory. A problem with interpretive theories is that the categories used to classify suicides are simply a matter of the researcher's judgment. They're subjective and unscientific. Atkinson develops a phenomenological view. He believes that it's impossible for coroners or researchers to objectively classify suicides. The facts are simply a social construction. From studies of coroners' courts, he finds that four factors shape the common sense theory of coroners. The presence of a suicide note is taken to indicate suicidal intent. Some types of deaths are more likely to be seen as an intentional suicide. Location and circumstances are important, and evidence of depression or particular difficulties tend to encourage suicide verdicts. In Atkinson's view, when positivists study suicide statistics, all they uncover are common sense theories of coroners. Critics of phenomenology, such as Hindis, point out that the logic of this view can be turned against phenomenologists' own theories of how deaths are categorized as suicides. Neo-Marxist Taylor tries to move beyond positivism and phenomenology using a realist approach. He agrees with phenomenologists that certain factors influence coroners. From a study of deaths on the London Underground, he found evidence of social failure or social disgrace tended to lead to suicide verdicts. However, Taylor still claimed that evidence from case studies revealed underlying patterns of suicide. Suicides could be seen as one of four types based on a person's certainty or uncertainty about themselves or others. Submissive suicide involves certainty that your life is over. Thanatation involves uncertainty about yourself and whether you should live. Sacrifice involves certainty that others have made your life unbearable, and appeal suicide involves uncertainty about others. Taylor explains some variations in suicide, for example, why suicide attempts are more serious than others, but his theory is hard to test and relies upon the interpretation of sometimes limited secondary data. Thank you for watching this video. I did think it would be quite a long one. I actually had to film it in two parts. But I hope this was really helpful, and make sure you go and watch my other sociology videos and my other subject videos if you haven't already. Thank you for watching.